When I opened my eyes, I didn't see my ceiling. Instead, there was a canopy of silk, gold threads shimmering like sunlight. The air smelled faintly of rosewater and something older, ink, and history. I sat up slowly. The bed was far too large, the sheets far too fine, and the mirror across the room reflected a stranger. Blonde hair, blue eyes, a face I'd seen before, on the cover of my favorite novel. I'm Eveline Lockhart, the villainess who betrays the kingdom and dies for it. I stumbled from the bed, searching for anything, a clue, a calendar, a mirror that might shatter this illusion. But the reflection didn't change. Neither did the voice that called from the door. My lady, the crown prince has summoned you to court. Lucian Valhart, the man who will one day condemn me to death. The story says I have 2 months before the execution. 2 months to rewrite a fate written in ink. But what does a villainess do when her only chance to live is to win the heart of the man she once ruined? The palace of Valenford was even more breathtaking than the novel had described, which only made it more terrifying. Marble pillars lined the grand hall. Silver chandeliers glittered like captured stars. Every step I took echoed, sharp, accusing. Eyes followed me. Whispers fluttered like moths in the dark. Lady Lockhart returned. Does she not fear the crown prince's gaze? After what she did. I kept my head high, though my pulse trembled beneath my skin. The original Eveline Lockhart would have smirked at them, would have sneered, lifted her chin higher, tossed her wine at some poor noble's shoes. But the Eveline was gone, and if I wanted to live, I had to bury her. At the far end of the hall stood Crown Prince Lucian Valhart, tall, composed, his expression unreadable. He wore the crown lightly, as if it bowed to him instead. The crowd parted around him like water obeying gravity. When his gaze met mine, the room seemed to tilt, cold, assessing, not cruel, but sharp enough to cut through every defense I had left. I curtsied, too deeply perhaps. The silk of my gown rustled like a sigh. Your Highness, I said. My voice didn't tremble. A small miracle. He regarded me in silence for what felt like forever, then said quietly, So the viper has shed her skin. A few nobles gasped. Someone chuckled. I forced a smile. Perhaps. She's learned not to bite, Your Highness. His eyes didn't soften. We'll see. He turned away, dismissing me with the smallest nod, and yet my knees nearly gave out. The rest of the evening blurred into fragments of sound and scent. Wine, laughter, a violin's melancholy note. Every conversation died when I passed. I remembered the novel too clearly. This banquet was where Eveline publicly insulted the prince, mocked his late mother's charity work, and sealed her fate as the kingdom's villainess. But tonight, I smiled instead. I spoke kindly to the servants. I thanked the musicians. And when the prince's advisor approached to provoke me, I only lifted my glass and said, Peace is a fragile thing. We should toast to keeping it intact. The man blinked, speechless. That wasn't the line the world expected from Eveline Lockhart. Lucian's gaze flicked toward me again across the hall, and for a heartbeat, I thought I saw curiosity flicker behind the frost. Maybe, just maybe, I could change this story. But then, from the edge of the room, a voice whispered, She'll never fool him. Villains can't love. The words stung more than they should have, because deep down, I wasn't sure they were wrong. Morning came, far too soon. Sunlight slipped through the heavy velvet curtains, painting gold across the floor, as if trying to remind me I was still alive. I almost wished it hadn't. The royal banquet was over, and somehow, so was my last illusion of invisibility. Every word I'd spoken, every glance I'd exchanged, especially with him, would now feed the court for days. I sat at the edge of my bed, still wearing the faint scent of rosewater from the night before. My reflection in the mirror looked almost unfamiliar, eyes hollow from sleeplessness, hair pinned too neatly for comfort, expression somewhere between pride and regret. The villainess had smiled her way through the fire, but the embers were still warm. Outside, I could already hear them. Whispers, footsteps, the rhythm of a kingdom judging. She dared attend the banquet? With that history, I heard the prince spoke to her himself. Maybe he meant to humiliate her again. They weren't wrong to think it. I had humiliated him once, in another version of this world, the book's version. The real Eveline Lockhart had mocked him so cruelly that her execution had almost seemed merciful. But I wasn't her, and this time, I would not die. Still, it wasn't enough to simply avoid the story. I had to rewrite it, line by line, gesture by gesture. So I started small. The servants' quarters were the last place a lady of noble birth should ever be seen, but when I pushed open the door, the smell of soap and freshly polished wood filled my lungs, sharp, clean, honest. Every conversation stopped, buckets stilled, a dozen eyes widened in alarm. I almost laughed at how predictable the fear was. "Lady Lockhart," someone stammered, "is there something you require?" "Yes," I said, stepping farther inside. "Forgiveness." The silence that followed was deafening. One girl, maybe 16, with freckles and trembling hands, dropped her tray. The sound of shattering porcelain rang through the air like a gunshot. She gasped and fell to her knees instantly. "Please, my lady, I'll pay for it. I swear I didn't—" "Stop." My voice was soft, but it cut through the room like a blade. The girl froze. I knelt. Yes, knelt, and picked up one of the broken pieces myself. It glimmered faintly in the morning light, a perfect mirror to the cracks I'd been pretending not to see in myself. Her mouth fell open. My lady, you shouldn't." "Shouldn't what?" I smiled faintly. "Touch what I've broken?" Gasps rippled around us. No one knew what to do with me anymore. The cruel heiress on her knees, holding a broken shard like a confession. "I'm sorry," I said quietly, "that I ever made you afraid of me." The girl blinked, tears welling in her eyes. You're apologizing?" "Yes." To you, I set the shard down gently, rose to my feet, and dusted my skirts. "We can replace plates. We can't replace people. Remember that?" And then I left, leaving behind a silence that wasn't heavy anymore. By the time I reached the upper halls, the rumor had already spread. Lady Lockhart picked up a servant's mess. They say she smiled while doing it. Maybe she's gone mad. Let them think that. Madness, at least, was unpredictable. That afternoon, 2 young maids were assigned to my wing, Clara and Marin. Sisters, barely grown, both with quick hands and quicker tongues. They exchanged looks when they entered my chambers, as if expecting to be shouted at. "You may relax," I told them, without looking up from the book I wasn't actually reading. "I'm not going to throw a vase at you." They stiffened anyway. "Of course, my lady." I sighed. I said relax, not rehearse obedience. That startled a laugh out of the younger one. Marin, I think. "Forgive us, my lady, it's just... You're not like we heard." I raised a brow. "And what did you hear?" "That you once made a cook cry because your wine wasn't chilled." I closed the book slowly. "That was true." They froze. "But I regretted it." That part no one remembered. Clara hesitated, then smiled a little. Well, it's different now. You're different. The word clung to me for the rest of the day. I began walking the palace more, not as the noble everyone avoided, but as someone observing, listening. Servants heard everything if you learned how to ask. The kitchen staff whispered about new tariffs, guards murmured about shifts at the council chamber, and the laundresses traded gossip about noble lords and their mistresses. Each scrap was a thread, and I began to weave them. Through Marin, I learned the crown prince visited the archives late into the night, alone, no attendants, no guards. Through Clara, I discovered that his advisor, Lord Roderick, had been meeting privately with merchants from the southern provinces. And through the head housekeeper, who had no reason to like me but respected my boldness, I learned that the Queen's personal physician had resigned suddenly after the banquet.
Something was moving beneath the polished surface of this palace. Something ugly, and I was finally in a position to see it. Weeks passed. My days became a careful rhythm of appearances and small acts. I visited the palace gardens with a smile that didn't tremble. I thanked the guards who opened doors for me, by name. I offered to help the head seamstress design a simpler line of dresses for court ladies who couldn't afford imported silks. Each action chipped away at the statue the world had built of me. Each rumor softened, and slowly, eyes that once looked upon me with contempt began to look with curiosity instead. But none of that prepared me for the moment I saw him again. Eveline Lockhart, the Crown Prince. It happened by accident, or fate, depending on who you ask. I'd gone to the West Library to borrow a book on medicinal herbs. He was already there, alone. The afternoon light poured in through tall arched windows, gilding the dust in the air. He was leaning over a desk, half his hair falling forward, the other half catching gold. His expression was unreadable, his focus absolute. For a moment, I just watched him. The book's version of him had been cruel, cold, the archetypal tyrant in the making, but this one looked human and handsome, tired, but still burning with something that refused to die. He noticed me after a moment. Lady Lockhart. Just my name, no venom this time, no mocking tilt to his mouth. Your Highness, I said softly, dipping my head. He studied me, not like a man assessing a threat, but like someone puzzling over a rewritten page. You've been busy, he said at last. Should I apologize for that too? Not at all. A faint smirk touched his lips. Though the court is in chaos trying to decide whether you've truly changed or if this is a new kind of manipulation. Then I must be doing something right. He laughed, a quiet, low sound that didn't belong to the prince I'd read about. When he left, I caught myself staring at the place he'd stood, and that frightened me more than any whisper ever could. After that, the rumors grew louder, about politics, not about me. Noble houses were shifting alliances. The Duke of Arran had withdrawn his support for a border treaty. The royal treasurer was under investigation for misplaced funds, and in the shadows of every whispered scandal, one name surfaced again and again, Lord Roderick, the prince's most trusted advisor. If the book's history was still true, Roderick would be the one who betrayed him, the one who would start the chain of events that led to my death and the kingdom's downfall. I couldn't let that happen, so I listened harder. I smiled wider, and when the servants' gossip led me to the discovery that Roderick had ordered confidential documents to be moved from the council archives to his private estate, I knew what I had to do. I had to warn Lucian. But how? If I approached him openly, it would look like manipulation, or worse, desperation. The court would twist it before morning, so I did what the old Eveline Lockhart never would have done. I wrote a letter. I didn't sleep that night. The moment the letter left my hand, I felt its weight everywhere, in the silence, in my chest. I told myself I'd done the right thing, that it wasn't for him, it was for the kingdom, for my survival. But the truth was uglier. I wanted him to believe me. I wanted him to trust me, to look at me and see something other than the villainess the world had written. Morning came cruelly bright. I forced myself into my routine with tea, letters, meaningless chatter with visiting nobles, all while my mind spun around one thought. Had he read it? Every echo of boots in the corridor made me flinch. Every rustle of silk made me turn, half expecting a royal messenger to appear with a summons, or worse, an arrest order. But nothing came. Hours passed, then a day, then two, and still, silence. I began to wonder if perhaps he hadn't received it at all, or if he had and simply didn't care. Because if Lucian Valhart ignored the warning, then the story I knew was already moving again. One day, I went to the east balcony for air. The sky was washed in violet, that fragile hour between dusk and night when the world forgets to breathe. Below, the palace gardens stretched like something out of a dream, and I caught sight of the marble fountain where I'd once humiliated a maid for spilling wine. The memory stung. How cruel she had been, not out of power, but out of fear. I was about to turn away when movement caught my eye near the far end of the garden. A figure, tall, familiar, Lucien Valhart.
The days after the banquet blurred into a quiet kind of exile. I was tolerated in the palace but never trusted. Every corridor whispered of my past. Every servant's glance weighed my guilt. And yet, I walked them all with my head high. If I was to survive, I would survive beautifully. The court called me Lady Lockhart the Reformed. The phrase dripped with irony, but rumors fade fastest when replaced with new ones, and so I became useful. To them. To him. It began with a letter. A simple warning slipped beneath the prince's door. There are traitors among your council. I didn't sign it. I didn't need to. The next morning, I was summoned to his study. Lucian stood by the window, sunlight pooling like molten gold around him. He didn't look at me at first. You wrote this, he said quietly. Would you have read it if I hadn't? I asked. His jaw tightened. You expect me to believe you act out of patriotism? No, I said. Out of fear. For the first time, something flickered in his eyes. Amusement, maybe pity. Honesty. That's rare in this court. I found it saves time. He turned then, truly seeing me. And you expect what in return? Nothing, I said, except the chance to keep breathing. He studied me for a long moment, then slid the letter aside. Very well. You'll help me uncover them, but understand this, one misstep, and I'll end your life myself. I curtsied, smiling faintly. I wouldn't expect less, Your Highness. That was how it began, our pact of shadows. I became his silent observer, the one who could move between rumor and truth unnoticed. The court still saw me as vain, foolish Eveline Lockhart, the perfect mask for a woman collecting secrets. We began to meet often, too often. At first in the library, then in the garden at dusk, when the roses bled their scent into the evening air. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were careful, deliberate, like a man used to being misunderstood. I found myself watching the way light touched his hair, how his voice lowered when he was thinking. I hated that I noticed. You should stop looking at me that way, he said one evening, without turning. What way? Like I'm something other than dangerous. Maybe I've grown fond of danger. He turned to face me. Then you've learned nothing. Or perhaps I've learned too much, I whispered. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. By the second month, the rebellion's whispers had grown louder. Noble families gathered under the pretense of charity and plotted the crown's downfall behind jeweled smiles. Lucian and I worked in secret, piecing together fragments of lies and ledgers. One night, we found ourselves in the royal archives again. A storm raged outside, thunder shaking the stained glass windows. I was reading a coded letter aloud when lightning flashed, and he caught my wrist. "Eveline," he said, voice low. "If they learn you're helping me, they'll kill me," I said simply. "But if I don't, the kingdom falls. Choose which ending you prefer." He stepped closer. Too close. "You speak of endings as if we're still in a book," he murmured. "Aren't we?" I asked. "One where I die, and you become the tragic hero." He laughed, soft, bitter. "You truly think I want that?" "I think you believe you must." He hesitated, then brushed his thumb against the back of my hand. "You keep saying you want to survive, Eveline. But you never said what for. Maybe I didn't know, until now." The moment cracked something open, a tension neither of us could afford to name. But the world never lets love bloom quietly. Forged letters appeared, bearing my seal, commanding funds to rebel camps. The next morning, soldiers came for me. The same hall where I'd once smiled and curtsied now echoed with the clatter of chains. I didn't fight. The story was catching up. Lucien didn't come to see me for 3 days. When he finally did, I almost wished he hadn't. He looked exhausted, haunted. A man torn between duty and the memory of a promise. "They found the letters," he said quietly. "I didn't write them." "I know." My breath caught. "Then why am I still here?" I asked. He turned away. "Because if I free you now, they'll hang us both." "I need time." "Time?" I laughed softly. "The book says I die tomorrow." "Then I'll rewrite it," he said, stepping closer, "even if I have to burn the pages myself." That night, the city burned. The traitors made their move, using my arrest as their spark. The charges were the same as the original book: treason, manipulation, seduction of the crown prince, and the evidence stronger. The traitors had learned from their last mistake. I didn't resist when they bound my hands. It almost felt familiar, like a story I had already read. Because I had. The Hall of Judgment was filled to its edges. Nobles in silk and steel, hungry for spectacle. And on the throne sat Lucian Lockhart, Crown Prince of Valenford, and the man who once swore to rewrite my fate. He looked different. Not the cold tyrant of the novel, but different. Something in between. A king in the making, and a man breaking beneath his crown. "Lady Eveline Lockhart," he said, his voice steady, distant. "You stand accused of high treason. How do you plead?" I met his gaze. "Does it matter?" the court murmured. He didn't flinch. "It does to me." "Then," I said softly, "I plead guilty." A hush fell over the room. He rose slowly, each movement deliberate, as if the air itself might shatter. "Do you understand what that means?" "I do." "Then why confess?" "Because the truth doesn't matter here." I smiled faintly. It never did. He took a step forward, his composure cracking. "You could have run. You could have waited for me to clear your name. And watch them destroy you in the process?" I shook my head. "No. This story always demanded a villain, Lucian. Let me play the part." "You think this is mercy?" "I think this is love." The court gasped. A few nobles snickered, but I didn't care. I hadn't spoken to them, only to him. Lucien's hand tightened around the armrest of his throne. "You want me to condemn you? To become the monster they expect? If that saves the kingdom, yes." He laughed once, harsh, disbelieving. "You've lost your mind." "Perhaps." But I've gained a heart for a moment. Neither of us moved. The world seemed to hold its breath. I remembered the book's ending, the execution in the courtyard, the prince's speech about justice, the way the people cheered, history waiting to repeat itself. But then he drew his sword, slowly, deliberately, the same blade that symbolized the crown's judgment. He descended the dais, step by step, until he stood before me. The tip of the sword hovered just beneath my chin. I lifted my eyes to his. "Say the word," I whispered, "and end it." He stared at me, the way a man stares at something he knows he'll never see again. Then he dropped the blade. It hit the floor with a sharp, echoing clang, and Lucian Veilheart, the crown prince of Valenford, sank to one knee before the accused. Gasps rippled through the court. "I will not follow a story written in blood," he said, his voice low, trembling with fury. "I choose my own ending." He turned to the council. "She is innocent." "And I have proof." The hall erupted. Shouts, protests, disbelief. But Lucian's voice drowned them all. "The true traitor is among you," he said, pointing toward the minister who had forged the seals. "And if any man dares raise a hand against Lady Lockhart, he raises it against the crown itself." The guards hesitated, then moved. Chains fell away. The minister's face went pale. And I couldn't breathe. I had prepared to die, not to be saved. When the uproar finally died, he turned back to me. His voice softened. "Do you still think villains can't love?" I swallowed hard. "I think they're the only ones who know how." He smiled then, not the polite smile of a prince, but the kind that belonged only to Lucian, the man beneath the crown. The rest blurred, the council arrested, the charges burned. By dusk, the tale of the villainess who confessed for love spread through the capital like wildfire, and by dawn I was gone from the palace once more. They said the prince let her escape. They said he let her go. But those who wandered the rose fields beyond the city claimed that at twilight, two figures often walked there together, one with a crown of thorns and one with a crown of golden hair. And when the wind whispered through the petals, it carried the sound of laughter. Soft, free, as if the story had finally found its ending. The roses bloomed differently now, not crimson, but pale gold, the color of sunrise. Sometimes, when the light falls just right, I can almost see her, the woman I used to be, the villainess who thought her story was already written, who believed survival was the same as living. But life, I've learned, is made of rewrites. Lucian says the kingdom calls me a ghost, that some believe I died the day of my judgment. Perhaps they're right. The old Eveline Lockhart is gone. In her place stands someone who learned that love isn't redemption. It's a choice, made every day. He visits the fields at dusk, still carrying that same restless calm. Sometimes we speak of the court, the reforms, the peace treaties, the endless work of rebuilding. Sometimes we say nothing at all. Silence feels holy after so much noise. He laughs more now, and when he looks at me, it isn't as a prince or savior or hero from some gilded tale, just as a man who found something worth defying fate for. Once I asked him, "If you could change anything, would you?" He smiled, brushed a petal from my hair, and said, "No." Because even the thorns led me here, and I realized, maybe that's all any story really is. Not about villains or heroes, just people who dared to love, despite how the world saw them. It's been 3 years since the day the kingdom changed. 3 years since Lucian stood before the High Council and announced the impossible, that the woman once condemned for treason would be his wife. I can still remember the silence that followed and the events. It wasn't outrage or shock, just disbelief so heavy it could crush air. But he stood firm, his voice steady, his hand finding mine. History, he said that day, was written by those too afraid to question it. Today, we begin a new chapter, and he placed his crown, the same one that had condemned me once, at my feet. The court gasped, the world trembled, and somehow I laughed. The palace no longer echoes with whispers. It hums instead, with laughter, with life, with change. Clara is now head of the royal household. She still scolds me when I forget to rest. Marin married one of the palace guards, the same one who once avoided meeting my eyes. They're expecting their second child. The council, too, is different now, half of them replaced with those who once had no voice. Lucian rules with a calm I've come to recognize as strength, not restraint. And I've learned to live without waiting for an ending. The people who whispered Villainess now call me Queen. And Lucian, the man who should have been my enemy, became my home. He comes to me then, barefoot and soft-eyed, holding 2 cups of tea. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asks. "Maybe I was waiting," I say again, smiling. He sits beside me, his shoulder brushing mine. "Still waiting?" "For forever." He laughs quietly, and the sound fills the room like light. When he kisses me, it feels like the world finally exhaled, like every ending, every scar,